Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to our review of Sherman Leader, the 2017 World War II tactical combat game from Dan Verssen Games. Let's start with our 1-minute power review. Key point, this is a game and not a simulation. Definitely want to keep that in mind before you make your purchase. Let's talk about the strong points. The game tells great stories, and the RPG elements with the leaders really kind of give you a sense of drama and get you attached to the commanders of your units. It's a fast playing game with rules that have a light cognitive load, so you can pick up a battle, play in 30 minutes, and move your campaign along over the course of a few nights. Really fun that way. Excellent components. With one exception that I'll mention later. There are lots of dice, so you might think, wow, this is a game of luck, but underneath that, behind that, is a lot of subtle strategy that makes a huge difference in the outcome of the game. Some weak points. The AI bot in a couple places feels rather incomplete. And although I mentioned the components are good, there's one thing that's a little bit disappointing with the components. Lastly, there is an element of luck. And sometimes in this game, you're just going to get diced. And if that happens in like week 6 of an 8-week campaign, that can hurt a little bit. Bottom line, I had a ton of fun playing this game. I really liked it. It's going to stay on my shelf. I'm going to come back to it. I'm about 18 to 20 hours in right now, and I feel like I'm only scratching the surface in many ways. So a big thumbs up for me. For the rest of the video now, we're going to do kind of a meaty review that puts a lot more meat and details into those early components, those early talking points, if you would, from the first part of the review. A side point too, we have a 13-episode campaign game with this all in video format. So if you haven't seen that yet, you might want to check it out. I'll put a link up top here. So let's go back to the first thing. A key point to consider about this game. It's a game and not a simulation. So over the course of that 13-episode campaign, there are a number of people who posted saying this really isn't realistic or that isn't realistic. And if you look at Board Game Geek, you see the same kind of criticisms there too. I think that's a little bit harsh on the game because the game at no point is really making any pretenses to be that kind of in-depth, accurate simulation of World War II combat. And it's apparent right from the start, okay? Because one of the way the core mechanic, if you would, for combat in the game is when units fire at other units, they get 2 shots. So for example, say a German tank, which is going to be the AI controlled side, fires 2 shots at you, you roll 2 dice. When you get an attack at the German unit, you're going to roll 2 dice. Now, if those hit, then you go to the next stage where you compare the defensive values of the unit and you roll 2 more dice, or however many hits got through after that first round, to see if those hits were effective or negated. So that's the second step, and those first 2 steps are the same for each side, right? But if you get to the third step, once the Allied fires, so once your player forces fire and get past that second step, the third step is you destroy the German unit or the Japanese unit, depending on which campaign you're playing. But if it's a hit on one of your own forces, you draw a damage chit. So what that means is you could very well pick 5, 10 different damage chits, and your tank is still going to be functional. And all it takes is 1 hit to wipe out the German unit. Now, what that means is, though, right, over the course of a campaign, your leaders are going to live on, but most of the battles you're going to go into, you're going to go in outnumbered at least 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1, or even 4 to 1, and you're going to look at the board and you're going to be like, wow, how are we going to be able to do this? You know, so right away you can see that the mechanic, the core combat resolution mechanic, isn't something that's very accurate. It doesn't make sense that a Sherman tank's going to get hit 5, 6 times and probably be okay with an equivalent hit, and the Germans are going to suffer like 5 times the casualties as the Allied forces. I mean, that's just not a realistic simulation. But it's designed in a way that for a role-playing type of game where battles continue and you've got leader permanence and unit permanence over the course of a 6, 8, 20 battle campaign, you can't kill the Allies off that fast, right? So it's a mechanic that's designed for the nature of the gameplay experience that's de-emphasizing the aspect of realistic simulation. But if you come to the game and you buy it looking for that type of simulation experience, you're going to be kind of disappointed, right? You can be like, well, why can we hit the German units once and they can hit us 5 times? We're okay, that doesn't make sense. This game sucks. Right? But that's not the point, right? The point is it's never trying to be that game. So you kind of have to let that go. And if you can't, I wouldn't suggest getting it because you're going to be disappointed. I mean, mortars can knock out Tiger tanks, right? And every hit is a hit. So a hit from a Stuart tank has the same potency as a hit from a Tiger tank. And you're like, well, that doesn't make too much sense, right? So if that stuff bothers you, you're gonna be frustrated and annoyed, right? You have to kind of put that to the side and say this is a game that's recreating the tension and drama of a World War II combat experience rather than highlighting or focusing on those simulation aspects. I think that's a very important point to consider before you go out and buy this. Perhaps even the biggest point, because if you're going to be in one camp and can't move to the other, yeah, you're probably going to struggle with the game, right? That's just a fact. So let's talk about, though, what you get in turn. So one of the strong points of the game, and I mentioned this early on, is the drama and the excitement that comes out of these games. So this is a game where it's de-emphasizing simulation and historical accuracy in order to highlight and paint with an elegant brush story and drama and the RPG elements of your units and your commanders. And this, by far, in my mind, is a powerful strength of a game, and it's something that I've found in this game that I rarely find in other games. I love campaigns that have permanence from one battle to another, and in this one you can have as long as an 8-week campaign. It might be like 20, 24 battles where you're gonna have one leader, and they're gonna start out as like this green leader, and then they're gonna get promotions, they're gonna kill units, and they're gonna be an ace, and they're gonna start being really badass by the time you get to the end, and you're gonna be like, wow, this guy, you're my hero. And then all of a sudden, they could get that damage chit you pick out where it's leader KIA, and you're going to be devastated. You get so attached to the leaders as they go through the battles. And rarely have I played a game where you get that kind of emotionally invested in your forces and your campaigns as your leaders you do. I swear, every time you're picking one of those damage chits in this, and you're like, no, don't let it kill this guy. And then you get no effect. You're like, oh, wow, we dodged another bullet there. The game is masterful. I love games that tell stories. I love games that have object permanence from one battle to another. This game does that. This game evokes stories. And again, sometimes you're halfway through a campaign and everything's going really well, and you're like, we got this. And then you pick up a couple of damage chits, and you're like, oh, we don't got this anymore. Things are going bad. So the game does a remarkable job, I think, of evoking those types of stories, creates tension. You're going to come down to the last dice roll to win the battle, to knock out the battalion. It just happens. It's like finely tuned along these ways to seem like it creates this amazing tension and drama as you play. By far, the biggest strength and strong point of the game. So let's continue on. It's also fast playing. I think in terms of complexity, I would give this a 3 out of 9. The rule book is light. I don't have the page count here, but you're going to learn how to play the game in maybe half an hour to an hour. There are some cases where like the edge rules are scattered on cards and in different places. So sometimes it's easy to miss something, but on the whole, you're going to have the game down and you're going to be along and you're going to be playing pretty quick. And it's a game that plays fast. You can play a battle in half an hour, sometimes 20 minutes. The Japanese campaigns tend to have force compositions that are a lot smaller than the German campaigns. So against the Japanese campaigns, you can play 3, 4 battles, 5 battles in a night sometimes. You just kind of fly right through them and things like that. So it's fast playing, it's fun. It's not a game that's going to drag out. You're going to be able to sit down, play a battle, 20, 30 minutes and move on and kind of redesign your forces and move between battles and weeks and stuff like that and go on. So that's a big plus, right? You're not going to get bogged down with like a 2 or 3 hour game over the course of an evening. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the components. The components in the game, I give our big strong point. I mean, you've got lots of different map things that you can arrange in different situations. You've got tons of German counters, tons of Japanese counters. You've got a whole Japanese campaign. I mean, the game by itself is a complete campaign, even if you're talking about just the Allied versus German campaigns. And then you've got this whole side campaign aspect. You've got 2 theaters of war where you've got a whole pile of Japanese units and counters and campaigns to play with as well. It legitimately could be 2 games worth of components into one game. You could have split this up and made it a German version and a Japanese version, all with the Allied units, but they're all in one box. Tons of replayability. I think if I were to give this a replayability factor, you've got 9 campaigns and 6 objectives, I believe, and all of those can be matched up. So that's 54 different ways you can start the game. You've got all the decisions around, you've got a big pile of unit cards to pick from, a big pile of commander cards to pick from and build your forces. So unit composition, all the subtle strategies and thinking that's evolved around that too. You could play this game for a long time. I mean, there's tons of replayability here. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 9. I probably wouldn't go higher because at a certain point in time, even though the maps are different, the campaigns are different, you're replaying the same type of combat situation. So after a certain point in time, you're going to be like, okay, this reminds me of one I played before. But the story elements and everything like that, tons of replayability here and tons of value inside the box. Maps are good. The only thing I will say about the maps, I found that the city hexes look a little bit they just look a little bit chunky. They don't remind me really of a World War II kind of what a city would look like. I feel like that might have been something that could be improved upon, but that's a minor detail. counters, cards. The counters are already curved. You don't have to clip them and stuff like that on the corners. So just really nice job with the components. There is one thing I will mention. It's a negative with the components, but I'll mention that when we talk a little bit about some of the negative points. Also, regarding the components, a big shout out to Dan Verssen Games for including leaders of color. You're going to find African American leaders, Hispanic leaders, Asian American leaders, and Native American leaders in the game. It's ahistorical for sure, right? You wouldn't expect that in a World War II unit composition force. But I think what it does, it invites people of color to the table, and we all know that wargaming is a hobby that could benefit from a little bit more diversity. Let's just be frank about that. So this is a way to do that. And more games and more companies, I think, should do that sort of thing, to take a slight step in that ahistorical direction, just to invite more people to the table, to give them kind of a sense of investment and relevance in with what's going on. So kudos to Dan Verssen Games for doing that. It's a good subtle step to take, but it's a strong step, and we need more of them like that. Let's talk a little bit about strategy and player agency. Now, I mentioned there's a dice element in the game, but one of the things that becomes apparent after you play this game for a while is that there is a lot of strategy underneath the surface of the game. So when you're trying to pick up your unit forces, you've got so many choices and different ways to put together your unit forces at the beginning of a campaign. And that matters. It's a huge difference. And learning all the subtleties behind that about building an effective force to go against a certain battalion, how you're going to put those together on a week-to-week basis, how you're balancing decisions on stress and which leaders need to be rested, whether you need to give a leader a promotion to kind of with using some of your special operations points. Special operations points in the game, by the way, they're kind of the currency. And you never have enough. So I found like when I'm playing a campaign, I'm always trying to figure like, okay, I could do this, or I could do that, or what's the best way to do it? So lots of fun decisions around how you spend those special options points, how you build your forces. The maps are always different too, so you've got a lot of different subtle strategy. I mean, it's a game where you want the enemy shooting at your lower value units. And so that's constantly what you're trying to do. You're trying to mitigate the odds that one of those German hits is going to take out your expensive Sherman tank. And so there's a lot of navigation and strategy that you're trying to take and trying to make in order to be able to keep your units alive and at the same time be able to do damage to the enemy units. And then on top of that, you have all of the risks that you have to decide what to do on when you kind of need to destroy a battalion in order to make your campaign objectives. And you've got like 2 turns left, and you know in order to be able to do that, you're going to have to push your units across an open field. And you're like, do I do that? Or I just take the half battalion damage? So there are just tons of decisions that happen both at the tactical level as you're fighting the battles, and then also at that operational level as you're building your unit forces, and as you're deciding those week-to-week decisions and who's in a particular battle and how you're going to split your forces up for a course of a week and what battalions you're going to try to attack and what things you're going to spend your special option points on. So lots of strategy, lots of fun decisions, which of course I think goes in line with how much fun it is to play one of those multi-week campaigns with all of those decisions both at the operational level and at the tactical level. All right, let's talk a little bit about what I think some of the weak points are with the game. First up, okay, this is a solitaire game. And so the solitaire game means that you have AI rules for the German side. And there are a few places in the game, 2 in particular that I can think of, where the AI bot feels incomplete, is the right way to put it. And where the rules say is, in these situations, you decide. Now, if those decisions didn't matter, I could see that being fine. There's sometimes too where you're going to just pick between 2 units that are exactly the same, or you're making a decision that the options are exactly the same. Then that's fine to say, yeah, as a player, you can make that decision. But I think the decisions here a lot of times matter in the course of the campaign, and it's something that should be more complete in a game that promotes itself as a solitaire game. Let me explain a little bit because I think it's actually a fascinating conversation about game design and a factor to consider if you want the game. So when the Germans are targeting units or the Japanese are targeting your units, the first priority is what's the easiest thing to hit. And the second priority is what's the lowest defense value. So you look at the easiest thing to hit for that particular unit, and then you look at the allied unit. If there's 2 that are equal, you say, okay, pick the one with the lowest defense value. The problem with that is sometimes you might have 2 units that meet those criteria, one of which is like a really cheap, for example, say a Stuart tank. This happened in the campaign we played. And the other is your very expensive death-dealing Wolverine tank. One costs 14 or 15 special operations points. The other costs like 8. So this Wolverine is twice as valuable to you, and the Stuart's only half as valuable. You want the Germans shooting at your Stuart tank. And the problem is when the rules say you decide, right, what do you do? right? So I played like the first week of this recent campaign that was on video saying, well, I'm going to play, my goal as a player in a solitaire game is I'm trying to beat your solitaire system. I'm going 100% out to beat the rules that you have imposed on the solitaire system. If your solitaire system says, I decide as the player, I should be making those decisions to my advantage to beat your AI bot at its highest level. So I made those decisions in favor of the allies, and I would have the Germans shoot, for example, at the Stuart tank. Or I have them shoot at the lower value infantry unit rather than our mortar team, which is like really expensive and another death dealer. And so we did really well in the first week, but then you get to the end and you're like, wow, I kind of had the Germans make some really dumb decisions. You know, like if I were the German commander, I would never shoot at the Stuart tank. You're going to shoot at the Wolverine tank. That's, you know, that just doesn't make any sense to shoot at the Stuart. It's worth half as much. It's not as dangerous, and the leader's kind of incompetent. So yeah, you're going to shoot at that Wolverine tank, right? Especially because they're both the same way to destroy it. So then as the next week you play, then the second kind of third week I play, it's okay, let's switch it around. And this time I'm going to make those you decide decisions as if the Germans, to the Germans' best advantage, how would I make that if I were the German player? And so then what you find, however, though, is I feel like then it's almost like a two-player game where you're making the decisions to the best opportunities of both sides. And that's not what a solitaire game should do. And this came up in the course of a conversation. I had posted on a gaming forum. I said, so I'm struggling with this type of decision. And then Tom Chick, who is a well-known game reviewer, came out and said, an AI system shouldn't ask you to make that decision. It shouldn't ask you to make decisions of importance about the AI system as a player. The game should take care of those for you. And I did reach out to DVG Games, and they got back to me and they said, yeah, you can play it either way. It's up to you. And they felt like it didn't really matter. I think their response was it shouldn't matter too much over the course of a whole campaign. I think, however, in some cases that's right. It might not matter depending upon the dice rolls you get and the chits you pull. But you know, if you're in week 2 of like a 6-week campaign and you get the Germans shooting at your Stuart tank instead of your Wolverine, they take out that Wolverine tank, that campaign's going to be really hard. They take out the Stuart tank, you might be able to replace it. So I feel like those things do matter. And there's another case too where it comes up a lot, which is the case of adjacent movement. And adjacent movement means that basically the enemy German unit, its movement order is to move to a hex that has cover. And sometimes what that would mean, those rules could really mean that the German forces could move right into the same hex as you are, or you could send them in the exact opposite direction, almost kind of have them retreat away from you. Especially when you got the city hexes on the board, that seemed to come up quite a bit. So that's a big decision. If you as the player deciding, and you've got like 4 German units there, and you know if all 4 German units come right at you and attack, you very well could lose a couple of units. It makes kind of sense to say, well, okay, I'm going to take like a couple of them, have an advance so we can knock those out, but I'm going to push the other 2 the other way, away from me. And so that's a decision there that it can make a big difference over the course of the campaign, especially in a game where a lot of what you're trying to do is to mitigate damage. So bottom line is, I feel like in a solitaire game like this, the AI rules shouldn't be asking the player to make those types of decisions, and they'd be benefit if the AI rules were fleshed out a little bit. So you didn't have these situations where you're asking the player without guidance to make a decision that could have a pretty big impact upon the campaign. Feels like it'd be pretty easy to flesh those out, though, as an individual player, but I feel like it's worth mentioning because as a game that advertises itself as a solitaire game, I think that's kind of an important feature. Okay, way too long on that one. Let's go to another potential negative of the game. Sometimes you're just going to get diced, or you're just going to have some really rough luck and you're going to pull a bad chit out of the cup and a couple times in a row, and you're like, wow. We're totally hosed now. It's just a fact. There is an element of luck in the game. Now, a big part, I think, of the strategy is mitigating that luck. You know, you want the Germans and Japanese shooting at your weaker units. You want you want them taking shots at units you can afford to lose. And so you're trying to navigate the map in a way and trying to build your strategy up so that you don't have a lot of shots coming at your expensive units, and they can stay back and they can do a lot of damage. But sometimes it's just not possible, depending upon what the map you get, depending on the situation you get. So your situation oftentimes is like, oh, okay, we kind of got to advance here. We got to go forward. And we just drew a bad chit, and that means our really experienced commander and his experienced tank just got blown up, and I don't see how we can go forward. So bottom line, sometimes you can make really good strategic and tactical decisions, and you're still going to lose. And other times you can make really weak tactical and strategic decisions, get caught completely out in the open, have some rough dice rolls for the Germans and some easy chit pulls for you, and you're like, no problem, we came through that. So if you are a type of player who has to have total agency over the outcome of your game, you might get frustrated sometimes when you see your best laid plans get laid to waste by a couple of inopportune dice rolls, especially sometimes these dice rolls, they're really like 50% chance you're going to knock out a unit. You know, you've got 50% rolls, you got 2 shots, both offense and defense, negation and stuff like that. It's kind of like flipping a coin as to whether you're going to knock the unit out or not. And if the Germans get like 2 or 3 really good hits and you miss, it can sometimes get a little bit frustrating. You can be sitting there going like, what can we do to win this one? Now, I like that. It doesn't bother me, but I will say, you know, in the Japanese campaign, especially where in the Japanese campaign where the forces are much smaller, you know, you might only have 1 Sherman in your campaign force. And if it's week 1 or week 2 of a 4-week campaign and that Sherman gets hit, you're like, well, we can't do any more things because we just lost our best unit. And we had him in the right place. We had him in high cover. But that little tank that's not supposed to hit us actually hit us. And I picked the chit that says, you know, destroyed. And so you're like, what can you do? So if that's the type of thing that can bother you, there is that element in here where sometimes the dice roll gods or the chit gods are just going to do you in. You know, that's a little bit, sometimes that can be hard to take. All right, the last little bit of a negative I want to mention here too is, and I mentioned how good the components are. I do have one exception, and I saw people mention this on Board Game Geek as well, and it happened to me. I'm not sure if you can see this. This might be a hard way to show it, but hold it up that way. I can try to show a close-up picture. The underlying mat on which the game board pieces lie warped, and so what would happen is the map pieces, little components, the pieces that you put together to make the game map, they were kind of moving around. They wouldn't really sit still and stuff like that. And now I know this isn't intentional, right? I know that a board warping like this isn't something that a game designer comes out and says, we're going to make it so the board warps after like, you know, a couple weeks of sitting out on a table or something like that. But our house is really dry. It's not really dry. It's not humid and it's not overly dry. Our house is a really good environment for keeping game components and stuff like that. So I feel like something like this shouldn't happen. And I know it's not intentional. I know it's accidental. I know it's not something that they want to happen. But, you know, the game's kind of expensive. I think the list price is close to $100, if not a little bit over that on the website. I feel like this should have been done a little bit better. You know, so it is a little bit disappointing to see that happen. I might try to flatten it out or something like that, but it seems pretty insistent on just kind of curving back up. So not a big deal, but I feel like, yeah, you know, considering how good all the other components are, it's kind of worth mentioning. It's like, that's a little bit of a bummer, for sure. All right, so what's the final verdict? The final verdict on this one is definite thumbs up from me. I really enjoyed the 3 campaigns I've played with it so far. I'm looking forward to continued play. Something I want to keep on my shelf. It fits, again, that niche. If you like games that tell stories, and if you like games that have some object permanence from one battle to another, and you have a whole campaign to play over multiple nights and things like that, and you know, characters that kind of evolve and level up and kind of get promotions and stuff like this, I think you'll really like this experience. And the replayability with the different campaigns and objectives, Japanese theater, German theater to play with, the leaders, the units, all the different ways you can build your forces and stuff like that, and the stories that come out of the game are a huge plus and a huge strength of this game. And I can't think of many games that I've played, board games that I've played, that have created and kind of built that sense of story and a story arc with its ebbs and flows over the course of a campaign. And that's worth the price of admission to me. I really like the game because of that. Now, I think a lot of times when people buy games, you're trying to buy the game for what your desire is. And I think the 2 caveats I would mention are, if you're thinking about getting this game, you have to again go back to that main point that it's a game and not a simulation. If you're looking for a hardcore simulation or a very accurate simulation of World War II combat, you don't want this. It's not going to make you happy. It's not the game you're looking for. You should try something else instead of this game, because that's not what the game is trying to do. The game is trying to emphasize those stories, that drama, the tension, the kind of multi-week campaign, the back and forth ebb and flows of battles and things like that. And that's what this game shines at. And in order to do that, it's made a lot of compromises on its simulation and accuracy of World War II combat. And then lastly, you know, I would be, if you have to have total agency over a game, it's going to be a bit tough. You know, there are going to be times where you're going to just, Lady Luck is not going to shine on you, and your campaign's going to fall apart. And if that's something where you're going to be like flipping the board over and throwing the pieces through the wall because it's like, why did I get this? We were doing so well. It's week 3, and now I have to start all over or something like that. You know, then maybe this, you know, this might be something that's not going to make you super happy. You know, I think you got to be able to kind of just roll with that and say like, oh, well, we're doing really well. Now it's week 3 and guess we'll start again, or let's see how well we do over the rest, but there's not much hope for us winning this thing, you know? And that's part of, I think, the fun of this, though, is that you really don't know. There's a lot of ambiguity. You can do a really good job. I think there's a ton of strategy here. I do think there's a ton of strategy. Let's make no mistake about that. But sometimes the best laid strategy is going to get laid to waste. And so you have to be someone who's going to be okay with that type of experience, you know? But if those two things, that kind of simulation necessity and the idea that, you know, sometimes luck's going to just kind of do you in, if those two things don't bother you, then I can't recommend this game more. I think it's really fun to play. I had a great time playing it, and strongly recommend it to people who are looking for that type of experience. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that brings us to the end. Again, we do have a 13-episode campaign with this, all in video format, where we have a 3-week campaign against the Germans. So check that out if you're looking for more and want to see how the game plays and stuff like that. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new, please consider subscribing. About 40% of the so of the content on this channel is historical simulation and wargame content. So a lot of other things going on that you might enjoy seeing. So thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.